the first thing I heard was the rosary. Click. 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 Black onyx beads against knuckles. Slow. Even. Worse than shouting. I stood outside Dante Rossi's study with a silver tray cooling in my hands, espresso going bitter in the cups while men inside discussed murder in low Italian. The door wasn't fully shut. It never was when they wanted the household to remember who paid for the walls. Too messy, someone said. He touched what was mine. Dante's answer. That was all. A chair scraped. Then a sharp sound, like a body meeting the edge of a desk. I kept my face still. After 11 months in the Rossi house, I had learned that stillness was its own language. The marble under my shoes felt like church stone in winter. Somewhere below, the generators hummed. Somewhere above, a man who technically belonged to the most feared alpha in Chicago stood outside his alpha's door balancing cups as though this was a normal marriage. The door opened with enough force to rattle the tray. Marco Bianchi, Dante's head of security, stepped out first. His jaw was tight. There was blood on his cuff that wasn't his. Signore, he said. I hated that title. Not because it was false. Because it was true in all the wrong ways. I went in. Dante stood at the far side of the desk near the windows. Jacket open, tie gone, shirt sleeves turned once at the forearm. The study smelled like cedar, gun oil, and the cold night sneaking in through old glass. One man knelt on the carpet with 2 guards on either side of him. He was barely breathing. Dante didn't look at the espresso. He was looking at a map spread open on the desk. One hand braced beside it, the other flexing once as if he had forgotten he owned bones. That was when I saw the blood across his knuckles. Fresh. My eyes went there before I could stop them. His did too. Leave it, he said. He meant the tray. Maybe the room. Maybe my curiosity. With Dante, verbs had a way of covering too much ground. I set the espresso down anyway. The man on the carpet made a wet sound. I should have left. Any Omega with sense would have. But the blood had already begun to slide toward Dante's wrist, and without thinking, without any strategy, without asking what kind of fool I was, I crossed the room, took the linen square folded beside the tray, and reached for his hand. The room changed. I felt it in the guards first, then in the man on the carpet, who looked up through one swollen eye as if he had just witnessed a stranger place his hand in a wolf's mouth. Dante's fingers closed once. Not around me, on instinct. Hard enough to stop me if he wanted. He didn't. I lifted his hand anyway. The skin across his knuckles was split. I wrapped the linen around them with more care than the room deserved. He stared at the top of my head. The beads clicked once against his ring when he moved. No one will clean that cut, I said because silence felt worse. It'll reopen. His voice came low. Are you giving me instructions? No. I'm saving Teresio's carpet. One of the guards made a sound that might have been a choked laugh if he'd wanted to die that night. Dante looked at me then. Really looked. His eyes were dark enough to turn expression into a rumor. There was a small scar at his temple I had learned not to ask about, a line at the corner of his mouth that only appeared when he was furious or holding something much tighter than fury. He wore power like other alphas wore coats, daily, without self-consciousness, as though it had grown to fit him. Little saint, he said. Not tender. Not kind. Just an observation with teeth. The first time he had called me that was 3 weeks after our wedding, when I had asked the kitchen to send food to a guard who'd been shot. He had said it then, the same way he said it now, as if holiness were either naive or inconvenient. I let go of his hand. The man on the floor was dragged out. The guards followed. Marco shut the door behind them. The study went quiet in the way only rooms full of violence can, quiet, but never empty. Dante peeled the linen once, testing the knot. You should be upstairs. I was bringing coffee. You shouldn't be outside this room either. I looked at the map, the blood near the edge, the espresso untouched between us. And yet something shifted in his face. Not warmth. Never that. Recognition, maybe, of the fact that I had stopped being frightened enough to hide it. That was his fault. He had married me 11 months ago in a chapel with 6 witnesses, 2 guns visible, and 1 sentence spoken clearly enough to change my life: you will be under my protection. There had been no vows he meant. No promises an Omega could build a future on. But protection is a dangerous word when you're 24 and grieving and stupid enough to think safety might grow into love if you stand near it long enough. I hadn't meant to ask him that night. I had meant to take the tray, go upstairs, and keep the last of my pride in one piece. Instead, I heard myself say, was any of it real? The generator hummed below us. Dante's gaze didn't move. Be specific. I hated that answer because it meant he already knew. The marriage. The words scraped coming out. Why you kept me here. Why you watched me like a responsibility and not. I stopped because I had reached the cliff, and there were only 2 options left. Jump or lie. He saved me the trouble. Because I promised your father, he said. Because your name attached to mine made you harder to reach. He paused, and the beads clicked once in his hand. If you're asking whether I married you because I loved you, Leo, the answer is no. The room stayed standing. I noticed that first. Then the second blow landed. I never loved you. He didn't raise his voice. That was the violence of it. He said it like a fact already signed and filed. I waited for humiliation to feel loud. It didn't. It felt precise, like a scene giving way somewhere no one else could see. Dante nodded once. My throat hurt. All right, I said. That made him blink. Just once. No tears came. Not there. I would have rather swallowed glass. I picked up the tray because my hands needed work. He watched me set the cups straight, watched me smooth the edge of the napkin under the saucers, as though order might save me from what had just been said. Leo. It was the first time he had used my name in days. I looked at him. He seemed about to say something else, maybe to soften it, maybe to make it worse. I would never know, because I did the only thing I could do and still remain myself. I walked out. Upstairs, I took the document tube from the false back of my wardrobe. The small leather repair case that had been my father's. And the prayer book with the cracked spine I had kept beside my bed since I was 12. I left the wedding ring on the nightstand. I left the life that had never really opened its hand. When I passed the front stairs, Marco rose from his chair. Signore. Don't, I said softly. Maybe he saw my face. Maybe he knew better than to touch me when I was that carefully composed. He let me by. Outside, the November air cut straight through my coat. The gates opened because no one in Dante Rossi's house imagined his Omega would leave on foot in the middle of the night. The city smelled like wet stone and exhaust and lake wind. I kept walking. Behind me, the gates shut with the weight of a church door. I did not look back. The apartment still smelled like glue, dust, and old paper. My old life had always lived above the Bellini Restoration Studio, 3 narrow rooms with sloped floors and windows that rattled when buses passed. I hadn't been there in almost a year. Dante's people had sealed it after the wedding, packed away my work tables and called it unsafe. When I unlocked the door at 3 in the morning, the air hit me like memory, paste, linen thread, lavender soap, the faint ghost of my father's tobacco in the bookshelves. A life scaled to human size. I stood in the dark with my bag still over my shoulder and cried for exactly 23 seconds. Not because Dante had hurt me, though he had. Not because I had hoped, though I had. I cried because the apartment still felt like mine after all the ways it shouldn't have. Then I wiped my face, set my father's repair kit on the kitchen table, and checked the locks. By 8, someone knocked. I opened the door holding a letter opener in my fist. Paolo Greco looked down at it, then at me, and sighed as if I had personally offended his breakfast. He was enormous, broad shoulders, dark beard trimmed close, expensive coat straining over a body that seemed permanently one meal away from homicide. Behind him stood 2 guards, and farther down the hall a man in navy scrubs with a leather medical bag. Dr. Marcus Ferraro. Paolo held up a paper bag. Terezio sent pastries. I brought black coffee for bitterness and protein bars for myself because my life is a prison. Marcus rolled his eyes. He says that every time he chooses boiled chicken over joy. I don't choose it. I submit to necessity. Against all reason. The corner of my mouth moved. Paolo noticed and pointed at me like I had validated his religion. There. Good. He's alive. Why are you here? I asked. He shifted, becoming less comic and more dangerous without changing expression. Because you left Rossi protection without permission, and now every idiot with a gun and a theory thinks you're easier to reach. You mean Dante thinks that? I mean Chicago thinks that. He glanced over my shoulder. May we come in, or do you intend to stab all of us one at a time? Because I skipped cardio. I should have said no. Instead, I stepped back. They came in with the contained efficiency of people used to entering rooms that might turn ugly. Paolo set the pastry bag down reverently and immediately took one look at my kitchen. No food, he said mournfully. Signore, what kind of rebellion is this? What kind were you expecting? I left in the middle of the night, Paolo said. Ah. He nodded as if heartbreak and starvation were adjacent issues. A strategic withdrawal. Marcus put his bag on the table and studied me with the brisk intelligence of a man who had stitched alphas together while they lied to his face. Any injuries? No. Sleep? No. Good. He smiled thinly. At least you're honest. Paolo was already looking around for structural weaknesses, entry points, and probably hidden bread. Boss says 4 men on rotation. No open curtains after dusk. And you call before going anywhere. I'm not taking orders from him. Then take them from me, Paolo said cheerfully. I'm delightful. I folded my arms. You're impossible. Also true. He was still smiling when he moved the chair nearest the door, sat in it backward, and placed a pistol on the table in plain sight. The room cooled. That part, he said, is not a joke. My chest tightened. St. Cecilia's bell rang from the church below, 9 slow notes that used to mean ordinary time. I hated the way fear could climb into a familiar room and make every object complicit. I came back here because I wanted one place that felt like mine, I said. If Dante wants a prison, he can build another one. Paolo's expression changed. Not softer exactly, but more careful. He didn't send me to make you disappear, Leo. He used my name. That, more than the gun, made me uneasy. What did he send you to do? Keep you breathing. The second knock came before I could answer. No one in the room reacted dramatically, that was the frightening part. Paolo simply rose. Marcus closed his bag. One guard moved left of the door, the other right. I put the letter opener down because suddenly it felt theatrical. Paolo opened the door. Dante walked in as if the apartment belonged to him too. He wore black wool and no overcoat despite the cold. There were rain-dark drops at his shoulders. The hall behind him emptied of sound in the way halls did when he entered them. He shut the door himself and looked around the apartment once, the old drafting table, the shelves of repaired missiles, the sink full of glasses I hadn't yet washed. Then he looked at me. The cut on his knuckles was wrapped in clean gauze now. Someone had redone what I started. I hated how much I noticed that. "You're not safe here," he said. No greeting. No apology. Of course not. I wasn't safe in your house either. His gaze dropped briefly to my bare hand, where the wedding ring used to be. That's not the same thing. It felt the same. The silence that followed had temperature. Paolo, sensing he was one sentence away from becoming collateral damage, grabbed a protein bar from his coat pocket and muttered, "I'm going to chew this in the hallway like a condemned man." Marcus seized his sleeve and dragged him with him. The guards followed. The apartment door shut behind them. Dante and I were alone for the first time since the study. I did not step back when he came closer. I wanted to. I didn't. "That was reckless," he said. "You told me the truth. I acted on it." His jaw moved once. "You left without security. You left without a husband." That landed. I saw it, a small, hard thing in his face. I shouldn't have wanted that. I did anyway. He moved close enough that I could smell the cold on him under cedar and smoke, and beneath that, the dark, volcanic scent of his alpha pheromones. The scent that had once made me dizzy, that had once promised safety and threat in equal measure. My pulse changed. He noticed because he noticed everything. "There are men looking for whatever your father hid," he said quietly. "They will use you to get it. I don't have anything. Riccardo Vescari believes otherwise." The name meant something old in the Rossi world. I knew it from overheard dinners and the way conversations bent around it. Advisor. Family ally. My father had once called him charming with the same tone priests use for snakes in the garden. "If this is about my father, you should have told me before you married me." Yes. The answer hit me harder than defense would have. I stared. "That's all you have to say?" "It's the truth." I laughed once, small and disbelieving. "You only like the truth when it cuts." His eyes lowered to my mouth and stayed there half a second too long. That was the first almost. It lived in the air between us, something sharp, something impossible, something I refused to name. Then he stepped back. "You can stay here today. By tonight, you move to one of my safe houses." "No. Little saint." Cold again. Possessive in its own spare way. "No," I repeated. He looked at the prayer book on my table, the one I had taken without thinking. His gaze lingered there, unreadable. Then he went to the window, drew the curtain an inch, checked the street below, and let it fall. "You can hate me from a safer address," he said. "I don't hate you." That was the problem. We both heard it. When he turned back, something in his stillness changed, just enough to be dangerous. I should have taken the sentence back. Instead, I stood there with my hands shaking at my sides and let him see that I had not yet learned how to look away. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. When he left, Paolo came back in carrying 3 more protein bars and a face full of tactical misery. "Well," he said, looking between me and the closed door, "that went badly enough to burn calories." I sat down because my knees suddenly wanted it. By noon, there were armed men in the hall, another car on the corner, and Dante's rules layered over my old life like iron over lace. I had gone home. His shadow got there first. By afternoon, my apartment no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a watched archive. I worked anyway. That was the one mercy of damaged paper, it demanded my hands and left less room for humiliation. The studio downstairs had survived its year of closure better than I had. The long oak tables were dust-coated but solid. The presses lined the wall like patient old men. My father's magnifying lamp still angled over the central bench, the bulb cloudy with age. When I turned it on, its yellow light made the room feel briefly inhabited by every careful hour we had ever spent there. I put on my apron, threadbare blue, ink stain on the pocket, mine. Upstairs, boots moved in the hall at measured intervals. Protection. Surveillance. Depending on your mood, they were the same word. The prayer book lay open under my lamp. It had belonged to my mother before fever took her, and to me after my father stopped speaking about God except in professional whispers. The leather cover was worn to velvet at the edges. 2 years ago, the spine cracked and I repaired it myself, sewing new linen tapes into the binding while my father watched from the far end of the table with a look I didn't understand then. I understood less now. Dante had looked at this book that morning as if it were a locked drawer he had already tried to open. That had been bothering me all day. So I started at the hinge. Restoration is part medicine, part listening. Paper tells you where it hurt if you stop imposing your own impatience on it. I eased the book flat, slid a microspatula beneath the repaired lining, and felt at once that something was wrong. Not with age, with weight. The board was too heavy on one side. I sat back. My father had taught me never to pry fast, hidden things tear easily when revealed by clumsy hands. I warmed the paste seam with controlled moisture, let the linen relax, and lifted the corner just enough to see a narrow cavity cut inside the board. Empty. My pulse stumbled. Someone had hidden something there once, something long and thin, something roughly the size of a folded document strip. The bell over the front door rang downstairs. I started hard enough to nick the paper with my nail, swore under my breath, covered the book with linen, and went to the stairs. Paolo stood in the doorway below holding 2 coffees and looking offended by gravity. I brought tribute, he announced. 1 black for your continued suffering, and 1 with sugar because even martyrs need glucose. You don't work, do you? I do. I'm here, aren't I? He lifted a paper bag too. And before you ask, no, I did not bring pastries. Marcus said if I keep eating my feelings, I'll never see my jawline again. Marcus sounds wise. Paolo clutched his chest. Say that quieter. I already love him more than dignity. He came upstairs without invitation because boundaries in Dante's world were decorative. When he saw my work table, he whistled. This place always smells like rain in an old church. Paste, I said. Whatever it is, it makes me want to confess sins I haven't committed yet. That implies restraint. Cruel. He set the coffees down and leaned over the prayer book. This? The famous artifact? I looked up sharply. Famous to whom? He straightened at once. Not guilty. Careful of things men have been told not to touch. Which meant Dante. My stomach went cold before it could decide whether to be angry or afraid. The front doorbell rang again. This time, Paolo's expression emptied itself of comedy. He moved past me, one hand already inside his coat. Stay here, he said. I didn't. From the stair landing, I saw Marco let Dante in. He crossed the studio in silence, coat dark with wind again, gaze taking in everything with one sweep, the tables, the shelves, Paolo's untouched coffee, the covered book. "It's rude," I said before I could stop myself. "How often you enter rooms like a verdict." Paolo made a sound somewhere between prayer and hunger. Dante ignored him. "Show me." I should have refused. Instead, I pulled the linen back. He came to stand beside me at the work table, too close. Close enough that the warmth from him touched my sleeve while the rest of the room stayed draft cold. His alpha scent was unmistakable now, dark cedar, gun oil, and something deeper, almost volcanic. My body reacted before my mind could stop it, a flush of heat at the base of my spine, a quickening pulse. I hated that. His rosary lay looped once around his hand, beads dark against his skin. Click. Once. My stupid heart noticed. "There was a cavity in the board," I said. "It's empty now." "You repaired the spine 2 years ago." "Yes." "Who handled the book after that?" "My father." "Me." "No one else." Dante looked at the lifted hinge, then at me. "You're sure?" I turned, stung by the implication. "This is what I do." He held my gaze. "I know." The words landed oddly. Not dismissive. Not doubting. Something worse, respect. That was the second almost. Not physical this time, something quieter and somehow more dangerous. The sense of being seen exactly where I kept my competence. I pointed to the board. "There's more." Using the lamp, I angled the paper so the surface caught light. At the gutter edge, beneath the old flyleaf, faint scoring marks showed where a strip had once been slid in and out more than once. "Repeated use," I said. "Not a one-time hiding place." Paolo watched us like a man standing too close to a church miracle and waiting for invoice details. Dante's mouth flattened. "Your father was moving something without telling me. To keep you alive." Anger flashed so fast it felt clean. "Then perhaps everyone in the city should stop deciding what keeps me alive." Before either man could answer, glass shattered at the back window. Marco hit the floor. Paolo had me down by the shoulder before my brain caught up. The room exploded into sound, boots, gunfire muffled by old brick. Terezio screamed from somewhere upstairs. Paolo swore about dying hungry. Dante moved with terrifying economy. He shoved the work table onto its side, covering me and the book in one motion, then drew and fired twice through the broken window before I even saw the shadow outside. The smell of gunpowder flooded the paste-sweet room. "Stay down," he said. I didn't argue this time. The shooting stopped almost as quickly as it began. Sirens wailed in the distance. Marco shouted into a radio. Somewhere near my ear, Paolo muttered, "If I get shot before Marcus says yes to dinner, I will haunt all of you." I looked up. Dante was still standing over me, one hand braced on the overturned table, body between mine and the broken glass. A narrow line of red ran along his jaw where a shard had caught him. "You're bleeding," I said. He stared at me for a fraction too long, as if that answer mattered more than the bullets. Then he straightened. "They found the book too quickly," he said to Marco. "Someone close is talking." There it was. Betrayal. Not named yet, but close enough to breathe. When the men began boarding up the window, Dante picked up my prayer book himself and handed it to me like it contained a live fuse. "You're coming with me," he said. I held the damaged book against my chest. "No." His gaze went to the shattered glass, then back to my face. "That wasn't your answer." He was wrong. The answer came when I realized he already knew this book mattered before I did, and he had never told me why. Dante had noticed my hands the first day because they never trembled around ruined things. He had noticed me that night in the study because I took his bleeding hand like it belonged to an alpha and not a weapon. Now, watching me cradle the prayer book to my chest under broken glass, he knew two things with absolute clarity. Ricardo had moved faster than expected. And Leo Bellini would rather die standing than obey softly. God help the men who mistook that for weakness. Dante didn't take me back to the Rossi house. He took me to the chapel on the north edge of the estate where his family buried their dead and hid their difficult conversations. It sat behind the main villa beneath bare cypress trees, stone-faced and private, the kind of place rich Catholics built when they wanted God nearby but not inconvenient. By the time we arrived, evening had dropped into a hard blue dark. The air smelled of wet leaves and lake wind. Armed men moved through the grounds in disciplined silence, their radios crackling softly. No one looked directly at me. No one ever did when Dante was close. The chapel doors were walnut and heavy enough to feel like a verdict when they shut. Inside, votive candles burned before the altar in red glass cups. Gold leaf glimmered around old saints whose expressions suggested they had survived worse men than ours. The marble floor held the day's cold. I stood under the painted dome holding my prayer book and feeling like an intruder in somebody else's grief. "This is not a safe house," I said. "It's where no one listens at the walls," Dante replied. "That's almost comforting." He glanced at me. "You should stop trying to sound fearless when you're angry." "I'm not trying. I am angry." "I know." That irritated me more than if he'd insulted me. Terezio Rossetti arrived with blankets, tea, and the expression of a housekeeper who had decided all armed men were fundamentally exhausting. He had silver hair combed back from a lined face, dressed in a tailored dark vest over a crisp white shirt, and the practical hands of a man who had run the Rossi house longer than Dante had ruled it. "You look pale," he told me at once. "Sit." "I'm fine." "That isn't what I said." He touched my cheek once, lightly, and something in me nearly cracked. Terezio had been the only tenderness in that mansion not loaded with confusion. He had smuggled me cannoli when I couldn't sleep, left novels outside my door, and never once asked why I cried in a house with heated floors and 14 bedrooms. Now he tucked a blanket around my shoulders as though I were still worth tending. Dante watched without comment from the first pew, one elbow on his knee, rosary moving through his fingers bead by bead. Click. 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 I hated that sound. I waited for it anyway. Paolo arrived 10 minutes later carrying 3 garment bags, a medical kit, and a face full of martyrdom. "If anyone asks," he announced to the room, "I died bravely while transporting carbohydrates I was not allowed to eat." Marcus came in behind him and smacked his shoulder. "You're carrying shirts." Emotionally. "They are pastries." Even Terezio smiled at that. Marcus checked the cut on Dante's jaw first. He let him clean it without a word, staring past all of us at the candles. When the cotton touched too near his temple, something changed in his face so fast I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking, a withdrawal, absolute and old. Not pain. Memory. Dante stood before Marcus finished. "I'm fine." "You're lying," Marcus said. "It will heal." "Of course. Alphas like you are disappointingly durable." Paolo took that as permission to rummage through the garment bags and produce a black sweater. "Boss, put this on before Terezio buries me for letting you catch pneumonia." Dante took the sweater. When he pulled his blood-marked shirt over his head, I looked away too late. Scars crossed his ribs in pale disciplined lines. One thicker mark ran under his shoulder blade, old and ugly and deeply healed. But it was the burned scar near his collarbone that held me, ragged, half-mooned, as if fire had once tried to claim him. I dropped my gaze at once. That was the third almost. Nothing touched, and yet my whole body seemed to know I had crossed a border. Upstairs, Teresio told me, as if he could read rooms and my face equally well. There's a bedroom prepared. I went because staying would have exposed too much. The convent's upper rooms had once housed visiting clergy. Now they held quiet furniture, locked drawers, and windows too narrow to reassure anyone. I set my prayer book on the small desk and tried to think. My father had hidden something in it. Dante knew enough to fear that Riccardo Vescari was moving pieces faster than Dante liked. And somewhere beneath all that, a worse truth kept bleeding through: I had loved an alpha who had never asked for it. There was a knock. I opened the door expecting Teresio. Dante filled the frame instead. He had changed into the black sweater. It made him look less like a public threat and more like something private and worse. The rosary hung from his hand. The candlelight from the hall traced the angles of his face into something almost tired. "We need to talk," he said. "We always need to talk. We just rarely do." His mouth shifted, almost a smile, and not at all kind. "May I come in?" It startled me enough that I stepped aside. He went to the desk, saw the prayer book, and didn't touch it. Good. Had he reached for it without asking, I might have thrown him out on principle alone. "Your father came to me 6 days before he died," he said. "He told me he had proof someone inside my organization had sold information for years. Routes. Names. Shipments. He said if anything happened to him, you would be in danger before you understood why." I stayed very still. "He wouldn't tell me where the proof was," Dante went on. "Only that he had hidden it well enough that the right eyes would know when to look. And you married me. To place my name over yours before Riccardo reached you. There it was, the last mystery opening at last. Did my father ask for that? Yes." The answer stole more air than anger did. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because the fewer people who knew." "I am not people in this, Dante." "No," he said quietly. "You were the target." I turned away because tears threatened and I would have rather bitten through my tongue. He came a step closer, not enough to touch. "When your father died," he said, "I had 2 choices. Put you in the ground after him, or put you under my protection in a way men would fear. I chose. You chose for me." Yes. The honesty of him was infuriating. It always had been. Dante didn't soften himself for anyone. That should have made him easier to hate. Somehow, it made hatred complicated. Below us, a door slammed. Shouting followed. Then smoke, real smoke, thin at first, then fast. Dante's head snapped toward the hall. Every line of him changed. Not fear in the ordinary sense, but something primal. Instantaneous. He crossed the room in 2 strides, seized my wrist, then my waist when the corridor darkened with men and alarms. "Move," he said. We hit the stairwell with smoke folding down from the rafters. A candle rack at the nave entrance had been knocked into a hanging cloth. Teresio was shouting for extinguishers. Men ran. Paolo cursed in operatic detail about dying in a church while dehydrated. I coughed. Stumbled on the 2nd step. Dante's hand closed at my waist, not my arm, my waist. Firm. Unavoidable. Heat through wool and blanket and skin. He turned his body to shield mine from the crowd and held me down against him just as a brass stand crashed where I had been a breath earlier. The force of it knocked my shoulder into his chest. My hand landed flat against the burned scar under his sweater. He went still, not for long, just long enough for me to feel the old violence buried in that scar wake under my palm. Then he moved again, dragging me through smoke toward the side exit while men beat at flames with coats and curses. Outside, the cold hit like water. I bent over coughing in the gravel. Dante crouched in front of me. "Look at me." I did. His pupils were blown wide. Ash had streaked one cheek. He looked furious, not at me, not even at the fire. At memory. At some old room still burning behind his eyes. "Lucia died in smoke," he said abruptly, as if the words had broken out of him by force. "My sister." Then he stood before I could answer, barked orders into the night, and became the boss again. Marcus got the rest from Teresio later while checking my lungs. Lucia, 16. Sophia Rossi, Dante's mother. Car fire on a road outside Giulia. Dante had been 19 and too late. Tenderness, I realized as the chapel yard filled with men and ash and sirens, was not absent in him. It was trapped behind smoke. By morning, the chapel smelled of damp stone and extinguished wax. The fire had been contained fast, more warning than destruction, but it left a black ribbon across the side wall and soot on the saint nearest the door. Men cleaned in silence. No one said sabotage out loud. They didn't need to. In Dante's world, accidents arrived with timing too elegant to believe. I sat at the upstairs desk with my prayer book open and a magnifier in my hand while the first pale light slid through the narrow window. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Dante's hand at my waist again, sure, unhesitating, the grip of an alpha built to command catastrophe. I hated that my body remembered before my pride did. The fire had loosened more than plaster downstairs. Heat changes adhesives. Humidity exposes repairs. My father used to say flame tells on every lie in a binding. He had meant glue, leather, false repairs. I hadn't understood until that morning that he also meant people. I held the warmed flyleaf under the lamp and watched faint lines rise through the paper as the trapped air shifted. Not writing exactly, pressure marks. My father's hand had been there, thin, disciplined, impatient with blunt tools. I dusted the page with graphite powder, and scored impressions darkened enough to read in fragments. Not prayers. Names. Shipment dates. Numbers. Street initials. In one line pressed deeper than the rest, hard enough to nearly cut the paper, El Salvador route. Vescary cleared. My mouth went dry. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned so fast the magnifier slipped from my fingers. Dante stood in the doorway, coat folded over one arm, hair still damp from a rushed shower. The black rosary wrapped once around his fist. He didn't apologize for entering, he never had. The only warning he ever gave a room was the way it changed around him. "You found something," he said. Not a question. I looked back at the page. "You knew my father kept records." I knew he feared someone inside my house. That's not the same. No. His gaze moved to the pressure marks. It isn't. I should have covered the book. Should have demanded answers first. Instead, I heard the strain in my own breathing and hated it enough to reach for steadiness any way I could. I picked up the magnifier. I aligned it again. I made my voice do its job. "These are impression traces," I said. He wrote on a page that used to sit over this one. "Hard pressure leaves memory in paper fibers." Heat lifted it. Dante came closer, not touching, never quite touching when it mattered most. Just close enough that I could smell soap over cedar, and that volcanic alpha scent beneath. My body responded instantly, a flush of heat, a subtle shift in my hormones that I couldn't control. I was close to my heat cycle. I knew it. He probably knew it too. The scent of my distress must have been obvious. He said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, read it to me. So I did. 3 shipment routes. 2 payoffs. 4 initials I knew from Rossi dinner tables. And Lucia's name, followed by Vescari's. When I finished, the silence in the room acquired edges. My father had more than this, I said. He wouldn't hide a war inside one prayer book and call it caution. Dante's eyes shifted to the leather document tube on the shelf beside my repair case. I followed his gaze too late. That was how my secret surfaced, not by confession, but because his stare found it and held. You took that when you left, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse. Recognition. I crossed my arms. It was my father's. What's inside? Nothing. Leo. I hated that his voice could strip lies down to their bones. I took the tube from the shelf and unscrewed the brass end cap with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. A rolled vellum strip slid into my palm. I had looked at it twice since my father's funeral and understood nothing beyond a few numbers and a seal impression pressed nearly flat with age. I had kept it because he had put it in my hands the week before he died and said, if I cannot finish it, don't let Bellini cowardice bury the truth. I hadn't told Dante because trusting him felt too much like kneeling. Now the vellum lay between us anyway. His jaw hardened. You had this all along. I didn't know what it was. You had it. I looked up. Would you have told me the truth if I handed it over? A muscle ticked once near his temple. Not answer enough. He took the vellum only after I set it on the table myself. Under the lamp, the old ink showed through in bands, a ledger strip. Names cross-referenced to dates, payments, routes. One column written in my father's Latin shorthand because church archives had trained his hand to disguise commerce inside sanctity. Dante read quickly, then more slowly. Ricardo paid to clear the Joliet route, he said. The room swayed around that sentence. For Lucia, I whispered. For the car. I sat because my knees stopped pretending. My father had known, or discovered it afterward. He had hidden proof instead of going public because public truth gets ordinary men buried. He had gone to Dante. Dante had married me. And somewhere in the middle, everyone had decided I was a thing to be moved rather than a person allowed to know why. My throat burned. Did you know before today that Ricardo sold them? No, Dante said. I believed him instantly. Which infuriated me. He reached for the prayer book, then stopped before touching the scorched margin. You restored this yourself? Yes. The hinge held through heat. That's what proper linen does. I swallowed. You think violence is the only thing that can keep a structure together? His eyes lifted to mine. And you think care changes what something was built to carry? Neither of us looked away. That was the fourth almost. Not a kiss, worse. A moment where I understood exactly how dangerous it would be if he ever said something gentle and meant it. A sharp rap broke the room open. Marco stepped inside without waiting for permission, face cut from stone. Boss. We have movement at the east gate. 2 unregistered vans. Paolo's checking the cameras. Dante's expression closed at once. And one camera feed dropped 10 minutes before the vans appeared. Inside help, I said. Marco glanced at me. For the first time, there was something like respect in it, or concern. Hard to tell with men who wore danger professionally. Yes, he said. And not from the bottom of the house. Dante handed him the vellum. Lock this in the lower vault. Marco took it, but I reached out before he turned. No. Both men looked at me. If that strip disappears, all we have is your certainty and my dead father. I stood, pulse skittering. I make a copy first. Marco's brows lifted the slightest fraction, like he hadn't expected me to know how to refuse armed men politely. Dante said, "You have 60 seconds. I moved. Vellum hates haste, so did I, but my hands knew their work. I fixed the strip under glass, set translucent archival tissue over the surface, and used the raking lamp to bring up the ink while sketching the columns in mirrored notation. My father had taught me that too, how to make a faithful copy no thief could read at first glance. When I finished, Paolo barreled in with 3 phones, 1 pastry, and a level of outrage that seemed to exceed the circumstances. "Good news," he said. "I found the camera breach." "Bad news, it was done by someone who can spell, which means we are in serious trouble." He saw the vellum, Marco, my face, Dante's, and stopped. "Ah," he added. "So emotionally, we are also in serious trouble." Even Marco's mouth nearly moved. Paolo looked at the half-eaten pastry in his hand with deep sadness. "This is why I stress bake relationships I can't have." "Marcus didn't bake that," Marco said dryly. Paolo clutched the pastry to his chest. Cruelty from all sides. The laugh that escaped me was small and wrong and necessary. Dante heard it. His gaze shifted. Something in his face eased for one impossible second. Then the radio on Marco's shoulder crackled with a gunshot. The room went cold. Dante turned toward the door. "No one moves him alone." Marco nodded once and disappeared. Paolo's humor vanished with equal speed. "Boss, I know." Dante looked back at me. What sat behind his eyes then was not distance. It was fury with a direction. "We have a traitor," he said. "Not suspected now. Known." And for the first time since I had met him, I watched Dante Rossi look afraid of what that meant inside his own house. They moved us before dusk. Not because Dante wanted to, because the Eastgate attack hadn't been the point. It had been a hand laid on the board to show how many pieces Ricardo could already touch. By 6, the chapel no longer felt private. By 7, Marco had changed the convoy route twice. By 8, even Teresio had stopped pretending any of us would sleep. I sat in the back of the armored sedan with the prayer book in my lap and Dante's copied ledger tucked inside my coat. Outside, Chicago slid by in smears of sodium orange and wet black, bridges, warehouse walls, the river shining like cut metal. Marco drove. Paolo was in the second car with Marcus, who had refused to remain at the estate when armed men kept arriving faster than clean bandages. "Seatbelt," Dante said. I looked up. He was beside me, one hand braced on the leather seat, gaze on the side mirror. He had changed into charcoal wool and a darker tie than a priest would wear in good conscience. No gun showed, which meant there were 3. The rosary clicked softly against his ring as his hand flexed. "I'm wearing one." "Good." I should have been grateful that his voice was steady. Instead, I wanted to shake him until the calm cracked and something honest fell out. "You could try sounding worried." "I am worried." There's a difference between being worried and sounding like weather. His mouth almost moved. Little saint, if I sounded the way I felt, Marco would drive us into the river. From the front seat, correct. That was the first time I had heard humor from him. It startled a laugh out of me before fear could stop it. Dante's eyes flicked toward the sound. He didn't smile, but his attention lingered. Another almost. The convoy turned under an old freight overpass where concrete pillars rose damp and gray around us. I felt the change before I understood it. Marco sat straighter. Dante's hand flattened over my knee, brief, firm, without permission, and entirely about survival. "Down," he said. The first impact hit the lead SUV. Not our car, metal screamed, glass burst somewhere ahead. Marco swore and threw the wheel. Our sedan spun hard enough to throw my shoulder into Dante's chest. Gunfire came next, not wild, efficient. Coordinated ambush. Dante had me on the floorboard before the second volley. His body covered mine. The air inside the car turned instantly hot with cordite and shattered safety glass. Someone outside shouted in Russian, not Ricardo's men alone then. "Bought hands. Contract muscle. Stay under me," Dante said. That was ridiculous. There was nowhere else to be. But the words lodged in my ribs anyway. The rear window blew inward. Marco fired through the broken windshield. The sedan rocked as another round hit the side panel. Dante pushed a weapon into my hand. I stared at it. "Safety's off," he said. "Point and pull only if someone opens your door." "I don't." "I know." The way he said it made room for innocence without mocking it. I hated how much that mattered. He was out of the car before my next breath. One movement, door open, body low, gunfire answering gunfire with terrifying precision. I saw him only in fragments through the blown side glass. Black coat, controlled violence, brutal economy of an alpha who never wasted motion because waste got people buried. A figure reached our door. I did what he said. The gun bucked in my hand. The man dropped away with a cry I would hear later in my sleep. I froze. Marco grabbed the weapon from me without looking and kept firing with his other hand. "Leo," he snapped. "Breathe now. Fall apart later." Somewhere to our left, Paolo shouted, "If I die under an overpass, tell Marcus I was shredded at my peak." "Shut up and move." Marcus yelled back. A dark shape came at Dante from behind one of the pillars. I saw the knife first, then the arc of Dante's turn, then blood, his. My scream never fully became sound. He shot the man once, close and final, and staggered against concrete. Red spread fast at his side. Everything after that happened in a blur stitched together by instinct. The attackers retreated as quickly as they had come. Sirens wailed in the distance. Marco shouted coordinates. Paolo, astonishingly alive, ran toward us with one sleeve dark and wet. Marcus dropped to Dante's side, and he shoved him off with the same stubborn force he used on bullets. "Leo first." "I'm not bleeding," I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. Head to shoes. Counting pieces. Only when he had confirmed them all did he let Marcus cut his coat open. That was when I saw the knife wound. Not fatal. Not clean either. Blood soaked the white shirt beneath his suit and kept coming. They got us to a safe apartment above an abandoned flower warehouse near the river, a place of steel doors, strict floors, and one room furnished as if violence occasionally needed somewhere civilized to sit. Marco set guards. Paolo went down the hall with Marcus, protesting he was mostly decorative damage. Teresio arrived with supplies before midnight because apparently no gunfight in Dante's life could outrun his soup. I found Dante in the spare room, standing shirtless by the sink while Marcus stitched his side. "You moved," Marcus said. "You talk too much. You bleed too much. I should have left." Instead, I went to the cabinet, found gauze, and held it out. Marcus took one look at my face and sighed. "Good," he said. "You can keep him from ripping the stitches." Then he left us alone. Dante's hands were braced on either side of the sink. Water ran pink beneath them. One of the stitches had already started to pull because of course it had. "You're impossible," I said. So I'm told. His voice was thinner now, the edges sanded down by blood loss. That frightened me more than shouting would have. I stepped closer. He watched me in the mirror, dark eyes too awake for a wounded alpha. My fingers hovered over the bandage before I touched him. Warm skin. Hard muscle jumping once under the pressure. The room smelled of iodine, old pipes, and his alpha scent, still there, still dark and volcanic, but thinned by blood and exhaustion. I caught myself breathing it in. You should be in bed. You should have left when I told you. Would that have stopped the ambush? No. Then don't spend your strength on useless accuracy. For one heartbeat, silence. Then, incredibly, his head tipped as if he was trying not to laugh with a hole in his side. I changed the bandage more carefully than I had in the study. Less shock this time. More knowledge. His breathing slowed under my hands. Mine didn't. You took my hand that night, he said suddenly. I looked up. In the study, he went on. You didn't ask what I'd done. You didn't flinch. You saw blood and wrapped it. The room went very still. That was foolish, I whispered. No. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then lifted again because restraint lived in him like a vow. That was the first foolish thing anyone had done to me in years that didn't have a price attached. My throat tightened. There it was, why him? Spoken by him at last, only to himself and me in a room where pain had made honesty cheaper than usual. I tied the bandage. My hand shook when I finished. He noticed because he noticed everything. Leo. I should have stepped back then. I didn't. If you stop looking at me like that, I said, the words barely surviving me, I might still know what I'm supposed to do. Something opened in his face and closed again as fast as lightning behind clouds. That was all the permission I had in me. He reached up slowly, giving me every chance to move. I didn't. His hand touched my cheek. Just that. The rough pat of his thumb at my jaw. The heat of his palm. The terrible care in how little force he used. The kiss was no more than a held breath made real, brief, unsteady only on my side. His mouth against mine with the restraint of an alpha treating tenderness like live ammunition. I felt the stop in him before I felt the want. He pulled back first, forehead lowering until it nearly touched mine. That is all, he said, voice wrecked and quiet, because if I continue, I will forget you are frightened. I'm not afraid of you, I said. The truth stunned us both. His eyes shut for one beat. When they opened, they were darker. War starts tonight, he said. As if summoned by the sentence, Marco's knock struck the door. Boss, Ricardo hit the south accounts. 3 dead. 2 warehouses burning. Dante straightened with visible effort. The softness vanished. The boss came back wearing my fingerprints on his skin. He took one step toward the door, then turned back. His hand closed once around the rosary at the sink. Instead of pocketing it, he placed the beads in my palm, black onyx, warm from him. Keep that, he said. I stared at the beads between us. Why? His gaze held mine. Because if they breach this room, I want one thing of mine already in your hand. He left before I could answer. In the corridor, men began to run. War had arrived. War, I learned, did not look like battlefield glory. It looked like 3 phones ringing at once in the middle of the night. It looked like Terezio asleep in a chair with a rosary of his own wrapped around one wrist because he had stopped pretending prayer and logistics were separate tasks. It looked like Marco with blood on his cuff that changed color from hour to hour and never belonged to the same alpha twice. It looked like Paolo trying to flirt with Marcus while he dug a bullet crease out of his arm, threatening to sue God for repetitive trauma. It also looked like me in the warehouse kitchen at 4 in the morning, boiling water for coffee while pretending I didn't hear bodies being counted in the next room. By the third day, Dante had become less a man than a force moving through corridors on too little sleep and too much decision. He barely ate. He spoke in short commands. He touched me only by accident, and those accidents had started to feel chosen. The beads he had given me stayed in my coat pocket. I told myself I kept them because they steadied my hands. That wasn't the whole truth. On the fourth night, Paolo took a bullet meant for Marco. It happened in the loading bay below when a false delivery truck made it past the first gate. I heard the shots from the stairwell and ran before anyone could stop me. By the time I reached the concrete floor, Marcus was already on his knees beside Paolo, pressing both hands into his side while he went pale and theatrical by degrees. "Tell my mother," Paolo gasped, "that I was magnificent." "You're alive," Marcus snapped. "So far." Blood soaked through his fingers. Paolo looked up and saw me. "Ah, signore." "Good. If I lose a kidney, please tell people it happened protecting art." "You hate art," Marco said, crouched nearby with a rifle still in hand. Paolo grimaced. "I respect emotionally expensive paper." Then his face changed. The pain got through. I dropped to my knees on the opposite side and held the compress where Marcus told me. Paolo's hand clamped over mine hard enough to hurt. I was grateful. Pain is useful when terror wants to float you away. "Don't you dare die," I said. He blinked at me, suddenly serious beneath the bravado. "Not before dinner with Marcus." Marcus looked up sharply. "Paolo." Paolo wheezed. "Hope." They got him upstairs alive. The blood stayed under my fingernails the rest of the day. That evening, Marcus cornered me on the back stair with exhaustion under his eyes and Paolo's blood on his shoe. "You can still leave," he said. I stared at him. He pressed a passport and a train ticket into my hand. "My name, not my married one." "Bellini." "Dante doesn't know," he said. "Terezio does. Marco will get you to Union Station if I tell him the boss ordered a medical transfer. There's a train east at 9:40. After that, a contact in Philadelphia. Then wherever you want." The air seemed to thin around us. "You're helping me run. I'm helping you choose while choice still exists." Below us, a door slammed. Men shouted over radios. Somewhere in the building, Dante said something in Italian that made 3 other men go silent at once. Marcus leaned closer. "Leo, listen to me. He will protect you until it kills him. That is not the same as being able to give you a life outside this." I looked down at the passport. Bellini. The name felt like a road I had not yet buried. "What about Paolo?" I asked. "He'll live if I keep hating him professionally." That almost made me smile. Almost. Marcus's face softened. "You are not trapped here. Do you understand me? If you stay, it has to be because you chose the darkness with your own eyes open. Not because he burns bright enough to make you forget the cost." By 9:30, I was on the station platform. Marco stood 6 feet away in civilian clothes that didn't make him look less armed. He hadn't asked questions. That, more than sympathy, made me suspect Dante hadn't ordered this. Marco followed instructions too precisely to improvise betrayal out of pity. The platform smelled like diesel, wet cement, and pretzels gone stale beneath the heat lamps. Families clustered around luggage. A little girl in a yellow coat dragged a stuffed rabbit by one ear. No one looked at me twice. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like standing outside my own life. In my bag were my father's repair case, the prayer book, the copied ledger, and a cream envelope I had carried for months without opening, because I knew exactly what it contained. A fellowship offer from the Vatican Conservation School in Rome. My dream before Dante. Before marriage as protection. Before learning how much a person could ache for a room to remain still. I opened it there on the platform. Acceptance. Housing. Start date. A future made of parchment, dust, and sunlight instead of steel doors and armed men. I read it once. Then I folded it carefully and tore it in half. Then quarters. Not because Rome had become worthless, because it belonged to a version of me that believed leaving danger was the same thing as ending it. Ricardo would still have the names. Dante would still go to war. Paolo would still be bleeding upstairs. And I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether walking away had been courage or cowardice dressed in prettier shoes. The train lights appeared in the dark curve of the track. Marco stepped closer. "If you board," he said quietly, "I'll make sure no one follows." I looked at him. "Do you think I should?" Something unreadable passed across his face, weariness, maybe, or pity. "I think this world eats the omegas who wait for alphas to become gentler than they were built." The train roared nearer. That should have decided me. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and touched the rosary, the beads Dante had left in my hand after the ambush. Warmth lived there only in memory now. Still, my fingers knew the shape of each bead. Click. Not real. Only imagination. But it was enough. I turned away from the train. Marco exhaled once, sharp through his nose. "You sure?" "No." My voice shook. "But I'm going back anyway." The cost landed as soon as I said it. Rome gone. Bellini alone, no longer a future. Whatever innocence remained in me would remain innocence by choice, not ignorance. That was different. Heavier. True. When I walked back into the warehouse close to 10:30, Terezio took one look at my face and opened his arms without a word. I let him hold me for 3 seconds and then stepped away because if I stayed there longer, I would cry like a child. Dante was in the operations room, maps, screens, men, silence. He looked up when I entered. His gaze dropped briefly to the bag still over my shoulder, the train ticket crushed in my hand, then back to my face. No relief showed. No anger either. Just something so controlled it had become visible. "You left," he said. "I had the chance." I stepped forward until every alpha in the room understood I was speaking to him and only him. I came back. No one moved. Dante's hand closed around the edge of the table. The rosary wasn't there, I still had it. His eyes dropped to my pocket once, as if he knew. Then he nodded toward the maps. Good. Only that. In front of his men. Only that. But when I turned to go upstairs again, I felt his gaze follow me like a hand he would not dare use. I had been given the door. I walked back through it myself. The mistake that cost us came 2 days later. And it was mine. I told myself I had earned the right to move freely inside the warehouse after choosing to stay. That was vanity disguised as usefulness. War does not reward either for long. Dante had moved the ledger copy twice already. The original vellum strip was in a bank box only he and Marco could access. Ricardo's men were pressing from the south docks and the west route both, testing weaknesses, buying police silence, setting small fires to measure response time. Every hour brought another phone call, another whisper, another body that used to belong to a name. I wanted to help. Wanting is not the same as knowing how. At noon, Marco came to the upstairs studio room they had half-built for me out of a former office. "We need the prayer text from the prayer book enhanced," he said. "Boss wants a clean copy before tonight." I should have asked why Dante hadn't come himself. I should have noticed Marco wasn't wearing his radio. I should have remembered that men under this much strain become most dangerous when they sound calm. Instead, I took the folder, tucked the rosary into my coat pocket, and followed him to the service elevator. The door shut behind us with a mechanical groan. I looked at the panel. He pressed B3. The records room was B2. My pulse kicked once. Wrong floor. Marco's hand stayed on the button. No. The world narrowed. He didn't point a gun, he didn't need to. The betrayal arrived more cleanly than that, in the way he would not meet my eyes. "Why?" I asked. The elevator descended. Steel cables hummed above us. "My son," he said. It took me a beat to understand. Marco never spoke about family. In men like him, silence was a lock. Ricardo has him. He's had him for 3 weeks. The words came out flat, scraped empty by repetition. He sent me pictures first. Then one finger from the man guarding him to prove he had the right room. The elevator kept moving. "You sold routes," I whispered. "I delayed them. Opened gates. Missed details I was supposed to catch." "And Lucia?" For the first time, he looked at me. There was no defense in his face, only a ruin that had learned to stand. "I wasn't there then," he said. "But I know who was. Ricardo has been doing this to fathers longer than Dante knows." The doors opened onto darkness and concrete. Men waited, not Ricardo's soldiers in expensive suits. Contract men. Cheap jackets. Gloved hands. One of them took my arm. I drove my father's microspatula into the back of his hand before he got a full grip. He screamed. Another man hit me hard enough to spark white along my vision. Marco swore and caught me before I hit the wall. "No damage to his face," he barked. "He wants him recognizable." I turned my head and spat blood at his shoe. His eyes shut for half a second. "I deserve worse." "Yes," I said. "They took me anyway." The basement level belonged to an old cold storage annex under the warehouse, abandoned years ago when the riverline shifted. Concrete, rust, refrigeration hooks removed but not forgotten by the ceiling. The room they locked me in had once held flowers. Now it held a metal chair, a drain, and one buzzing light that turned every human thing the color of spoiled milk. Ricardo arrived an hour later. He was elegant in the way old knives are elegant, silver hair, navy overcoat, gloves soft enough to suggest money that had never needed clean hands. I had met him twice at Rossi dinners. He had kissed my cheek, praised Teresio's table, and complimented Dante with the fondness of an alpha admiring a horse he had once trained. Now he smiled at me as if we were still at supper. "Leo Bellini," he said. "You resemble your father most around the eyes." That look of disappointment, as though the world failed to uphold decent archival standards. I said nothing. He pulled up the chair opposite mine and sat. Dante always did prefer the difficult ones. I'm not his. Ricardo's smile shifted. Not in the legal sense, that paperwork can be replaced. Not in the emotional sense. He spread gloved hands. That answer interests me more. I held his gaze because terror hates to be witnessed. You sold Lucia, I said. He tilted his head. I allowed an inconvenient wife to remain visible. Something inside me went cold enough to feel clean. She was 16. She was a son his mother intended to take away from the family. Ricardo leaned back. Love makes fools of Omegas first and Alphas second. Sophia wanted out. Dante still believes love is a fire that happened to him. I was trying to teach him it is leverage. There it was, the mirror. Not just evil instruction. A philosophy of power so pure it had rotted into religion. My father found out, I said. Too much. Too late. Ricardo's gaze lowered briefly to my pocket. And now his careful boy carries sacrament beads in a war room and thinks that makes him less likely to break. My hand tightened around the rosary through the fabric. He had noticed. Of course he had. Where is the original ledger? He asked. I said nothing. He sighed. Your father hid data inside repaired bindings because he believed paper outlives cowardice. He was right. But people don't. When he stood to leave, Marco stepped into the doorway behind him. Our eyes met. For the first time since the elevator, his mask slipped, not enough for forgiveness, enough for grief. Don't let him hurt Terezio, I said. That landed. Because he flinched. After Ricardo left, I looked around the room and forced my breathing slow. Metal chair. Drain. Single light. One rusted radiator pipe along the wall. And on the floor near the baseboard, flakes of old paper pulp from flower wrap backing that had once lined storage boxes. Paper. I smiled despite the split in my lip. Restoration had taught me 3 useful things: what heat does to adhesives, how humidity warps cardboard, and exactly how easy it is to make alphas underestimate anything that looks delicate. I tore the hem from my shirt, soaked it from the pipe condensation, and began working at the old electrical casing with the pin from my hair and the spatula hidden in my boot. If Dante came, I needed time. If he didn't, I needed more than prayer. Marco's absence hit Dante like a misfire. By the time the service footage looped and my workroom stood empty, he already knew, not the details, the shape. Betrayal always had a geometry. He found the train ticket stub in the upstairs trash and nearly broke his own hand on the wall because I had come back once and he had still failed to keep the door safe behind me. When he saw the rosary missing from my coat hook, something colder than panic entered him. I had taken it. Which meant I was frightened enough to hold what he touched. The light buzzed. The pipe sweated. Time stopped pretending to be linear. I worked. Not elegantly. Not like a conservator in a clean studio with a climate table and gloves. Like the son of a restorer and the omega of a mafia boss who had finally run out of room for delicacy. I pried the electrical plate loose with the hairpin, stripped the wet cloth into narrower bands, and fed damp fibers into the exposed junction until the current began to spit and chatter. The first spark burned my knuckle. The second took the light. Darkness fell so suddenly it rang. Voices shouted outside. Boots. A curse. Someone yanked the door, found it jammed because I had shoved the metal chair under the handle, and started forcing it inward. I moved to the far wall, rosary wrapped tight around my fist, and waited with my father's spatula in my other hand like it was a saint's relic and not a sliver of sharpened steel. The door burst. The first man came in blind to the dark. I slashed his cheek and dove low under his reaching arm. He caught my coat instead of my throat. The fabric tore. I ran. The corridor beyond was refrigerated, cold and lined with old rolling racks. Emergency lights glowed red at floor level. Alarms had started somewhere above, not because of me, because somebody else had arrived. Gunfire cracked in the distance. My heart knew the answer before my mind did. Dante. I ran toward the shots because apparently survival had become intimate enough to make me stupid. A hand caught my wrist at the corridor turn and slammed me against concrete. Marco. He was bleeding from the shoulder and breathing like a man 1 minute from collapse. "Wrong way," he said. "You don't get to tell me where to go. Listen." His grip loosened. "Ricardo moved my son an hour ago." He lied. There was never a trade. Something ugly crossed his face. There was only a leash. I stared at him. He shoved a key card into my hand. "West Freezer Gate. End of hall. It opens to the loading ramp. Paolo's team is there." "What about Dante?" His eyes shifted past me toward the advancing gunfire. "He went for Ricardo. Alone." Meaning the part of him that could survive this might not be the part that came back. I could have run. That was the true exit, maybe more real than the station platform. Open gate. Escape route. Enough chaos to disappear. Instead, I heard myself ask, "Where?" Marco gave one broken laugh. "You really did come back for him." I came back with my eyes open. He nodded once, as if that answer belonged to a language he respected. Then he pressed the service pistol from his belt into my hand. 2 steps later, a shot took him through the chest. The force threw him backward into the wall. He looked surprised, which was somehow the worst part. I dropped beside him on instinct. Blood filled his mouth when he tried to speak. "My son," he said. "We'll find him." His head moved once. "No. Or too late. Hard to tell." He pushed at my hand until I understood he wanted the key card taken. Not comfort. I took it. His fingers closed around my sleeve for one last second. "Tell Dante," he whispered, "I was weaker than he was." Then he died before I could lie to him kindly. I left him there because the living demanded it. The corridor opened into the main storage floor, where the cold room doors stood half-blasted from their hinges and armed alphas moved through steam from ruptured pipes. One body on the concrete belonged to a contract shooter I had seen in Ricardo's basement. Another belonged to one of Dante's guards. I stepped over both and found Paolo behind a loading pallet, pale as paper and still somehow talking. "Ah," he said when he saw me. "The missing Omega returns. Marcus owes me $50. I said you'd stab someone before crying. You're supposed to be in bed. I am in medicine now. This is field work." He squinted at the gun in my hand. Very proud. Deeply concerned. Same time. Marcus crouched beside him, loading with furious competence. Relief crossed his face so fast it hurt to see. "You're bleeding. Not enough to be interesting." That sentence alone proves concussion. A crash echoed from the office corridor beyond the freezer line. Not random. Heavy. Deliberate. Dante. Paolo saw it on my face and swore. "No. Absolutely not. If you run toward him, I will personally die of stress. I need the records room map." Marcus stared. "Leo. I know old storage architecture," I said fast. "Church annexes. Freight basements. Flower warehouses. They reuse layouts. If Ricardo took the office wing, there's a second service passage behind the dead box line for air circulation." Paolo blinked. I have never been so attracted to stationery. I grabbed the chalk marker from the pallet and sketched the likely corridor on the concrete. Marco's keycard fit the access panel exactly where it should. Paolo looked at the outline, then at me, and all the joking dropped out of him. "You can actually get us there?" "Yes." Marcus caught my arm before I moved. "If you go in there, you may watch him do something you can't ever unknow." I thought of the study. The blood. The way he had looked at me first after the ambush, only to count whether I was alive. The way he had stopped after kissing me because fear mattered more than hunger. "I know," I said. We moved. The service passage was narrow, lined with coolant pipes that dripped onto our shoulders like cold sweat. At the end waited an office with one shattered door, one overturned desk, and Riccardo Vescari on his knees with Dante's hand around his throat. For one impossible second, no one saw me. Dante's back was to us. His gun lay on the floor. There was blood at his hairline and more on his cuffs. Riccardo smiled up at him through the chokehold like an alpha finally meeting the ending he had trained for. "Do it," Riccardo said. "Become me properly." Then Dante heard my breath. He turned. There are moments a life hinges on so quietly you only hear them later. Dante seeing me alive was one of those moments. Everything in him changed at once: murder, relief, rage, disbelief. Too much for any face to hold cleanly. He released Riccardo enough for Paolo to tackle the older alpha sideways with a groan that suggested heroism was terribly hard on his diet. Dante crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't ask if I was hurt, he already knew I was. Blood on my lip. Torn coat. Bruises rising. He caught my face between both hands so carefully it nearly broke me. "Leo," he said. My name like a wound reopening. I touched the blood at his temple. "Marco is dead." The truth landed. I saw it. A flinch so deep it looked like stillness. He gave me this. I held up the key card. And the route. Dante closed his eyes once. One breath only. Then he opened them and pressed his forehead briefly to mine, wordless, desperate, raw enough to feel like prayer. That wasn't our first kiss. It was more intimate. Behind us, Paolo grunted. "If anyone plans to declare feelings, do it while I am crushing an old alpha. I would like emotional compensation." Riccardo laughed through split lips. "See? This is why love ruins discipline." Dante turned slowly. I had never seen him look more like the worst stories told about him, not because he was loud, but because he had become quiet enough to kill cleanly. One of us might not survive what came next. We all knew it. Riccardo knew it too. And he was still smiling. They took Riccardo alive for exactly 43 minutes. Long enough to clear the warehouse. Long enough for Marcus to bully Paolo onto a gurney while he argued that dying horizontal would erase his shoulders. Long enough for Terezio to arrive, see the blood on my coat, and mutter a prayer fierce enough to sound like a threat. Long enough for Dante to stand in the freight elevator with Riccardo handcuffed at his feet and become so still I understood movement itself was being rationed inside him. Then Riccardo laughed at Marco's death. That was what ended the 43 minutes. Not the betrayal of Lucia. Not the years of theft. Not even the kidnapping. Marco, for all his failure, had died trying to give something back. Riccardo mocked it. Dante heard. So did I. "Take him to the river house," Dante said. No one argued. The river house sat on the far south edge of Rossi territory, where the city thinned into industrial dark and old money hid its ugliest decisions behind brick walls and willow trees. It had once belonged to Dante's grandfather. Men still spoke of it in lowered voices, which told me enough. I went anyway. Dante told me not to. "I'm ending this tonight," he said in the armored SUV, one hand braced on the seat in front of him, blood dried dark at his temple. He wouldn't let Marcus stitch properly. "So am I. This is not your work. That man killed my father and sold your sister and had me taken underground like a parcel." My voice was steadier than I felt. "Do not tell me where my life stops being my work." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Permission. Surrender. Respect. Hard to separate with him. Maybe they were the same thing. At the river house, the air smelled like lake mud, old wood polish, and ghosts. The paneled study upstairs had taxidermy eyes on the walls and a fireplace laid but unlit. Ricardo sat tied to a chair in the center rug like a guest who had outlived courtesy. Marco's copied file lay on the desk beside Dante's gun. I knew then what Dante intended. Not torture. Truth first. He questioned Ricardo the way he fought, with no wasted language. Dates. Names. Routes. Accounts. Which alphas had been bought? Which police captain? Which dock clerk? Which cousin? Ricardo answered some because arrogance likes witnesses. He lied on others because habit outlives usefulness. I stood at the desk comparing his answers against my father's copy, correcting where I could, touching the shape of the money trails because my father had trained my eye to follow columns without losing meaning. That was my place in the final violence, not decoration, not hostage. Ricardo denied the Vatican account. I slid the prayer book onto the desk and opened to the pressure marks. You press too hard here, I said. My father caught the transfer because you used church restoration funds to launder an emergency payment. He noticed because no real conservator abbreviates pigment purchases that way. Ricardo looked at me with something like real interest. Carlo taught you well. He taught me enough. Dante's gaze flicked to me. Pride. Quick and dangerous, like a lit match in a dark room. Ricardo saw that too. Of course he did. That is your weakness, he said to Dante softly. Not love. Recognition. You want him to see a man beneath the weapon. That makes you steer slower. And you? Dante asked. What made you this? Ricardo leaned back as far as the ropes allowed. Accuracy. No. Dante's voice was flat. Cowardice with manners. The silence after that was cathedral deep. Then Ricardo did what villains too certain of their own philosophy always do, he made it personal. Your mother begged, he said. That was unpleasant. Lucia didn't. He watched me as if I had failed him. Much like your Omega does now. Dante moved. It was so fast the chair tipped before I understood he had crossed the room. His hand caught Ricardo at the throat and hauled him half upright. The crack of the old wood floor under the chair leg sounded indecently loud. For 1 second, I saw the future Ricardo had intended all along, Dante reduced to a pure instrument of rage, every humane line burned out of him. Dante, I said. Just his name. Nothing else. He froze. Not because I had power over him in some fairy tale sense, because he was still himself enough to hear me inside the worst thing in him. His grip loosened 1 fraction. Ricardo smiled with blood on his teeth. There. That hesitation. Sophia would have hated what you became. But this, he laughed. He would hate that more. Dante let him go. Then he stepped back to the desk, picked up the copied ledger, and handed it to me. Read the last line. I looked down. My father's mirrored notation, payment code, route clearance. One final addendum I hadn't fully translated under pressure. If found after my death, Sophia Rossi tried to leave with evidence. Vescuri arranged the fire. Dante must not become the proof of him. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I lifted my eyes. Dante saw the line in my face before I spoke it aloud. That was enough. Something in him changed, not softened exactly, but aligned. He looked at Ricardo as if at last he had found the exact shape of the debt. He didn't kill him with his hands. He took the penknife from my repair case instead, my father's knife. Bone handle. Narrow blade used for lifting leather and scraping old glue. Not a weapon designed for glory. A tool designed for precision. Dante cut Ricardo's bonds with it. Ricardo laughed once in confusion. Then Dante placed the blade on the desk, slid the file of evidence across the polished wood, and pressed the recorder button on Marco's salvaged phone. You will sign a confession naming every bought official and every route you sold, he said. Then you will repeat it on record. Ricardo stared. And if I refuse? Then I shoot you in the mouth and release the books anyway. The older Alpha's smile faded. It took 11 minutes. He signed because he believed until the end that systems like ours survive scandal better than conscience. He confessed because Dante described exactly how many of Ricardo's hidden accounts were already frozen and which of his lovers had been moved to federal attention. Accuracy against accuracy. Mirror against mirror. When it was done, Dante shot him once through the heart. No speeches. No spectacle. Efficiency more disturbing than rage. Ricardo hit the floor and stayed there. I didn't look away. That was the choice I'd made. Later, when the body had been removed and the file duplicated 3 times for 3 different enemies who hated Ricardo enough to circulate it widely, we stood alone in the River House study while dawn threatened the windows. He made you into something, I said. Dante looked at the blood on the rug. Yes. And? His gaze shifted to me, to the prayer book still open on the desk, to my father's knife beside it. And I had to choose what I would remain. The cost of that choice lay all around us. Marco dead. Paolo wounded. Lucia still gone. Innocence, mine and his, no longer even abstract. Still, something ended. Teresio called just after sunrise to say Paolo had woken demanding broth and compliments. Marcus had cried where no one but Teresio saw. The bought officials were already turning on each other. Dante took the phone, listened, and finally exhaled. Then he looked at me across the ruined room and said the only words that could possibly matter after a night like that. It's over. War ended untidily. Bodies still had to be buried. Accounts still had to be closed. 2 police captains resigned for health reasons, which in Chicago has always been a dialect of fear. The papers ran stories about organized financial crimes and a tragic warehouse fire. Nobody printed Lucia's name. Nobody printed my father's. Dante made sure both were carved in stone anyway. Lucia at the family chapel. Carlo Bellini in St. Cecilia's side garden, where paper flowers from old funeral wreaths used to blow against the fence. Paolo survived, which he announced to everyone like a heroic inconvenience. I had a near-death revelation, he told me 3 weeks later from a chair in the Rossi house's restored kitchen. If Marcus refuses to love me, I may have to become interesting. Marcus snorted from the stove. Start by taking your antibiotics. Teresio swatted Paolo's shoulder with a wooden spoon. And stop flexing at the soup. I'm not flexing. This is how grief sits on me. I laughed hard enough to bend over the table. That was how healing began, I think, not with peace, with ridiculousness permitted back into the room. I hadn't moved back into Dante's bedroom. That surprised everyone except Teresio, who had the good manners to pretend not to notice. We lived in the same house now by deliberate choice, but I kept my own room on the east wing and my own workroom near the library, where morning light fell clean across the conservation table. Dante had built for me from reclaimed walnut and steel. He had done it without asking. I told him that was tyrannical. He said the drawers were lined with suede so I should suffer beautifully. We were learning each other in smaller ways now. How he took coffee only after dawn and only if I handed it to him. How I spoke too much when nervous and went silent when I was already hurt. How his hand sometimes hovered at my back in crowded rooms without landing. How I still woke at certain noises and he never pretended not to notice the nights I wandered into the chapel garden instead of sleeping. The rosary had become a shared object without discussion. Sometimes it was in his hand during meetings, beads clicking softly against his knuckles the way they had the night I first stood outside his study with coffee on a tray and hope arranged like glass in my chest. Sometimes when he found me bent too long over damaged paper, he set the beads beside my lamp and left without a word, as though acknowledging that steadiness could be loaned. One rainy afternoon, Paolo limped into my workroom carrying a sealed pastry box and gossip in his posture. I bring cannoli and intelligence, which is more reliable? The cannoli. Cruelly. He sat without invitation and lowered his voice. He has had the ring in his desk the entire time, you know. My hand stopped over the torn manuscript page I was backing with tissue. What ring? Paolo stared at me. Leo, if I must explain your own tragic symbolism, I will charge consulting fees. Heat rose up my throat. You're impossible. And yet informative. He leaned closer. Also, if you break his heart now, Marcus says he'll support Omega rights and Omega wrongs, but he will still make me drive him through it. Kindly plan your timing. I threw a rolled scrap of tissue at him. He caught it with wounded dignity. That evening, Dante found me at the kitchen table repairing a child's missile Teresio had discovered in storage, burned along the edges from the chapel fire, pages stuck together by old smoke. Outside, rain tapped at the windows. Inside, garlic and basil lingered in the air from Teresio's sauce. The house felt improbably human. He set 2 cups of tea down and stood there a moment as if rehearsing nothing. Paolo spoke to you. He does that constantly. About the ring. I looked up. He didn't evade. One of the things I had learned after the war was that Dante's honesty came quicker once he stopped using cruelty as a shield. Not easier. Just quicker. Yes, I said. He reached into his pocket and set the ring on the table between us. My wedding band. Plain gold. Small enough to seem ridiculous given the amount of ruin it had survived. I kept it, he said. I know. I should have returned it when you came back. Probably. He nodded once, accepted the rebuke, then sat opposite me, forearms resting on the worn wood where Teresio needed bread and Paolo complained about destiny and I had somehow begun to belong. This cannot be a fairy tale, he said. I nearly smiled. That's fortunate. I don't look good in passivity. His gaze warmed, a rare thing, visible only because it had cost him so much to become possible. No. You don't. Rain moved harder against the glass. He glanced at the child's missile in front of me, its blackened leather eased open under soft weights and blotters. You saved that, he said. I stabilized it, I corrected. Saving comes later. Is there a difference? Yes. I smoothed a page edge with the bone folder. Stabilizing means it won't get worse in my hands. Saving means it can be touched again without fear. He went quiet. Then, in that economical way of his, he crossed the entire emotional distance with one sentence. Teach me the second one. I looked at him for a long time. This alpha, this impossible, violent, disciplined alpha who had once told me he never loved me and now sat at a kitchen table asking not for absolution, not even for romance, but for instruction on how not to ruin what mattered. My throat tightened. What are you asking, Dante? He reached for the ring, turned it once between thumb and forefinger. The beads of the rosary in his other hand clicked softly against his knuckles. I am asking whether you would marry me now. Not because your father asked. Not because my name protects yours. Because I know what losing you costs me. His voice dropped. Little saint, I would like the rest of my life to answer to that honestly. There it was. Not grand. Not clean. Weighted with everything. I cried immediately, which was embarrassing and apparently inevitable. He didn't move to stop me. He just sat there with all that dangerous patience and let me have the truth of it. Yes, I said finally. But if you ever speak to me like you did that night in the study again, I'll take half your art and all your coffee. A very small smile touched his mouth. Extortion is attractive on you. He came around the table then, slowly, enough time to refuse. I didn't. He slid the ring back onto my finger with hands that had killed and protected in equal measure. Then his hand moved to the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair, tilting my head just slightly to the side. His mouth found the gland at the juncture of my neck and shoulder. The scent gland that had been calling to him since the first night in the study, I realized. The place where an alpha's mark would bind us forever. I love you, he said against my skin. I should have said it then. I should have said it 1,000 times before I learned what it meant. And then he bit down. The pain was sharp and bright, a piercing ache that radiated through my entire body. But beneath it was something else. A flood of warmth, of connection, of belonging so profound it stole my breath. His alpha pheromones poured into me through the bite, and I felt him in every cell of my body. His rage, his grief, his desperate, consuming love. I gasped, my hands fisting in his sweater. He held me through it, his arms wrapped around me, his mouth still pressed to the mark he'd made on my neck. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark and shining, and there was blood on his lips. Mine. Now you're mine, he said, his voice rough and reverent. And I'm yours. Completely. Forever. I touched the mark on my neck. It was tender, swollen, still pulsing with his scent. With him. When he kissed me this time, it was warm, settled, and fully chosen. No hurry. No fear mistaken for urgency. Behind us, Paolo whispered from the doorway, if anyone needs me, I'm crying for medical reasons. Marcus dragged him away by the collar. Dante's forehead rested briefly against mine. The kitchen was bright with lamplight. Rain kept time at the windows. The house did not become innocent, neither did we. But when he said, come to bed when you're done, little saint, the words held no ownership I needed to resist. Only home. 10 months later, the first thing I heard was the rosary. Click. Click. Not outside a locked study this time, at my own work table, where afternoon light poured across repaired ledgers, sharpened bone folders, and a shallow bowl of lemon peels Terezio claimed made the room smell less like scholarly despair. The new Bellini Rossi conservation wing occupied the restored carriage house behind the villa. Half archive, half workshop. Funded by money Dante had once used for less holy purposes and now funneled, legally, to his enduring irritation, into church records, neighborhood documents, and family papers nobody important had valued until fire or water touched them. I was standing over a damaged marriage registry from 1924 when Dante came in without knocking. Some habits remain because love doesn't erase structure, it only teaches it better manners. He had lost the jacket somewhere between the main house and my workroom. His sleeves were rolled once, tie loosened, hair wind-touched from outside. There was a shallow cut across his knuckle, probably from the crate hinge he had insisted on moving himself because delegating simple labor apparently offended his nobility. The beads clicked once against his ring when he saw me notice. I set down my folder. What did you hit? A stubborn box. The box won. His mouth nearly moved. Temporarily. That almost smile still startled me, not because it was rare now, but because I remembered when it didn't exist at all. I came around the table, took his hand, and turned it palm down under the light. There it was, blood along the knuckle, a clean cut, annoying rather than serious. I didn't ask permission. I never had, not the first night, and not now. I reached for the linen strip in my apron pocket and wrapped his hand as if the wound mattered more than the weapon. More than the Alpha's name. More than everything he had once thought tenderness made impossible. His gaze stayed on my face the entire time. Outside, children from the parochial school were being walked through the chapel garden for a history lesson. Their voices drifted in through the open window like birds that hadn't yet learned fear properly. Somewhere in the house, Paolo complained that fatherhood hadn't improved his abs. Marcus, now his husband, despite every sane forecast, told him to hold the baby before he prescribed silence. Teresio laughed. The sound reached us faintly and changed the air. When I tied the knot, Dante closed his fingers around mine. There, I said. You'll survive. I know. But he didn't let go. His eyes had gone dark in that old familiar way, not with danger now, but with depth. The kind that made me feel watched and chosen in the same breath. I knew that look. It still unsettled me. Maybe it always would. Some tenderness should. What? I asked softly. He exhaled once through his nose. The beads moved against his knuckles. Click. Do you know, he said, what you did to me the first time? I laughed lightly. Married you under dubious terms? His thumb brushed the inside of my wrist, where my pulse jumped. No. In the study. Blood on my hand. An Alpha half dead on my carpet. You should have been afraid of me in the useful way. You should have stepped back. Instead, you reached for the wound. I remembered every inch of that night. The bitter coffee. The smell of cedar and violence. The sentence that broke me. The door I had closed behind myself because staying would have turned me to something smaller. You noticed that before I did, I said. I noticed it before I knew I was done for. I smiled despite the sting in my throat. Done for? Yes. His gaze didn't waver. You made me visible in a room where I had spent years being only feared. Do you understand what that cost me? I thought of Lucia. Sophia. Ricardo. Marco. The river house. The station platform. The kitchen table. All the versions of him that had stood between weapon and Alpha and chosen again and again to remain both without letting the first devour the second. It cost you the part that could pretend not to need anyone, I said. A slow warmth touched his face, not surprise, recognition offered back. Yes, little saint. There was the nickname one last time, full and gentle and carrying every chapter of us inside it. He lifted my hand to his mouth and kissed the linen dust on my knuckles. Then he took the rosary from his pocket and laid it on the table between us. The beads caught the light. Onyx. Worn smooth by years of worry and prayer and the impossible task of holding power without losing oneself to it. And it was then that I felt it. The nausea had been building for weeks, but I'd dismissed it as stress. The exhaustion, the strange sensitivity to smells, the way my body had felt different. The way my hormones had been fluctuating in ways I couldn't explain. I knew. My hand went to my stomach. Dante's eyes followed the movement. Leo? I looked at him, at this Alpha who had told me he never loved me, who had meant it, who had lost me, and who had fought like hell to get me back. At the man who had learned tenderness like a second language. At the Alpha who had built me a workshop and kept my ring in his desk and asked me to teach him how not to ruin what mattered. I think, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, we're going to need a bigger workshop. His gaze sharpened. What are you saying? I took his hand, the one I had wrapped in linen that first night, the one that had killed and protected in equal measure, and pressed it gently against my stomach. I'm saying you did more than marry me again, Dante. His breath caught. The alpha who never showed surprise, who had stared down Riccardo Vescari without flinching, who had taken a knife and kept fighting, he stood perfectly still, his hand warm against me, his dark eyes searching mine. A pup? The word came out rough. Wrecked. I nodded, tears spilling over before I could stop them. I didn't know for sure until now. The way I've been feeling, I should have realized. But with everything. He kissed me before I could finish. Not careful this time. Not restrained. A kiss full of everything he had never been able to say out loud. When he pulled back, his forehead pressed to mine, his hand still covering my stomach, I felt something wet on my cheek. Not my tears. His. Little saint, he breathed. My little saint. I laughed through the tears. I'm not a saint anymore. I'm going to be a father. You were always a saint. His voice cracked. You walked into a room full of blood and wrapped my hand. You came back when you had the chance to run. You faced down Riccardo Vescari with a microspatula. His thumb traced circles against my stomach. And now you're giving me this. I held him. The alpha who had said he never loved me. The alpha who had meant it, until he lost me. The alpha who had built a house and a workshop and a life around trying to deserve me. I never loved you either, I whispered. At least not then. But now. His arms tightened around me. Now. Now I can't imagine a life that doesn't have you in it. I pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Now I love you. Even when you're impossible. Even when you enter rooms like a verdict. Even when you call me little saint like it's a dare. He laughed, actually laughed, a sound so rare it made my heart ache. I'll try to be less impossible. Don't, I said. I like you exactly as you are. I just want you to keep learning. Learning what? I took his hand and pressed it back to my stomach, where our pup was growing. How to love without armor. How to let me in. How to be a father. He kissed me again, soft and reverent. Then he knelt in front of me, Dante Rossi, the most feared alpha in Chicago, on his knees in my workshop with his hand on my stomach and tears on his face. I'll learn, he said. I'll learn everything. Just stay. Just keep being here. Keep wrapping my wounds. Keep calling me out. Keep loving me even when I forget how to love myself. I pulled him up and held him. I'm not going anywhere, I said. You said you wanted the rest of your life to answer to honesty. This is me being honest. I looked down at the rosary on the table, the beads that had been with us through every chapter. I picked them up and pressed them into his palm. Keep these, I said. But only if you promise to let me keep you. He kissed the inside of my wrist, right over my pulse, where the bond mark pulsed warm and constant beneath my skin. Already kept, little saint. Already kept. Outside, the children's voices drifted through the window. Paolo yelled something about needing help with the baby. Marcus shouted back about him needing help with his ego. Terezio laughed. Terezio always laughed. And in the workshop, surrounded by repaired books and restored papers and the life we had built from the wreckage of a marriage that had never been real until it nearly ended, I held my alpha and felt our pup grow. The first thing I heard was the rosary. Click. Click. Not a warning this time. Not a threat. A heartbeat. The last thing I heard, hours later as Dante carried me to bed and whispered promises against my skin, was 3 words. I love you. He said them like he meant them. He meant them. And this time, I believed him. The end.